Hello, my name's Drew Wagar, and I'd like to talk to you about my upcoming novel, The Lords of Midnight. The Lords of Midnight is based upon a computer game of the same name written by a chap by the name of Mike Singleton back in 1984. Now back then computers were extremely primitive by modern standards. The amount of space they had available on them is pretty much smaller than today's average length email. And yet within that incredibly small confine, Mike was able to write a game that had an entire landscape within it. People by all sorts of interesting characters, armies, a landscape that you could walk through with mountains and lakes and forests and all sorts of other interesting things. The sort of stuff that you'd expect in a fantasy realm. It really was a game changer at the time, and it won many, many awards in its heyday. Since then, it's gone on into something of a bit of a game legend, and there are many people who still play it even now. It's been rewritten. It's available on Android and iOS if you want to check it out. And I was lucky enough to meet the creator of those remade games, Chris Wilde, who also happens to be the IP custodian for the lore and the background for Lords of Midnight. Sadly, Mike passed away in 2012, but Chris is effectively keeping the torch alive for the games and all the other story that goes with them. Now Mike had actually written some novellas for Lords of Midnight, partly as an extension of the gaming manual, but also to provide a bit of background to the world that is represented. And that world is quite sophisticated. There is the land of midnight, which has been cursed into eternal winter by the actions of an evil sorcerer known as Doomdark, who's also known as the Witch King. And during the game, you're tasked with defeating this evil and restoring the land to obviously what it's supposed to be. And you've got multiple ways to do it with multiple characters that you can control. Now back then there was also a competition right back in 1984 for the first player who won to have their novel, have their game experience, if you like, turned into a novel. Now for various reasons this didn't happen, partly because the first player to complete the game actually completed it in 2 weeks after the game was released, which was much, much faster than the original publisher expected, and I don't think they were ready for it. That book, unfortunately, never happened. But 30 years later, after I had met Chris Wilde, the opportunity to write the book presented itself. Now, there are many, many games from that era, but not many of them lend themselves to being converted into stories. In my experience, there are only two, one of which I'm sure you've heard of, which is Elite, and I was fortunate enough to be in a position to write a novelisation for that game. But Lords of Midnight was the other Spectrum game from that era that I was very, very excited about, and it also had a rich, rich backstory to it. These games really kind of allowed you to inject your imagination into the gameplay. You could play these games for hours. They were very, very different from the early sort of Space Invaders and Pac-Man style games where you had 3 lives and you played for 5 minutes and then died and tried again. These games were consuming, they were complex, they were impressive, and they took days, hours, weeks sometimes to play through. They were very, very compelling experiences even back then. Now alas, that original novel didn't take place, but I had always had a soft spot for Lords of Midnight throughout all those years. And when the opportunity presented itself a couple of years ago for me to have a go at writing the novel, I really, really couldn't turn it down. So for the last 2 years, I've been working with Chris and working with Dan, my publisher, to bring a novelisation of the Lords of Midnight to fruition, and we're almost just a few days now ready to launch it, which is really, really exciting. So what is this book about? Why would you be interested in reading the Lords of Midnight? Well, if you like fantasy stories, this is right up your street. So the Lords of Midnight is a fantastic realm. It has dragons, it has trolls, it has unusual strange creatures, it has epic battles, and it has the trademark impossible quest and something of a chosen one character in it. And you might be thinking, hang on, this sounds all very derivative. And it's fair to say that the Lords of Midnight was very much inspired as a game by the obvious candidate in this genre, Lord of the Rings. So if you're a fan of that kind of story, you're going to find something to enjoy here. But I will stress that I've been very aware that Lord of the Rings exists, and Lords of Midnight is not, Lords of Midnight the novel is not a pastiche of Lord of the Rings. We've veered away from that, and we've written a modern fantasy story within the confines and staying true to the original game. But we've really been aware that we are writing something that has to exist alongside all the giants in this genre as well. So yes, there's an epic quest. Yes, there are battles. There are dragons. There's all sorts of exciting stuff going on. And Lords of Midnight is a complete end-to-end story, but it's likely to be part of a series as well. Fortunately, Mike Singleton didn't just create one game, he created several. So we've got a rich lore and a rich background to exploit for future stories as well. So it's a homage to the 80s in a sense that it's arcing back to a computer game of that era. It expands on the lore of that game. So if you're a Lords of Midnight fan and you've enjoyed those original games, you'll find an awful lot within the book that makes you go, aha, yes, I remember playing that game in the 80s. If you're just a fantasy fan, you're just going to enjoy what is an excellent, well, at least I hope, I would say that, wouldn't I? An excellent fantasy style story. But it's not formulaic, traditional in the classic sense. But if you want to get your teeth into a new fantasy saga that has a rich background lore that's been quite carefully considered, we've got material for maybe 3 to 4 books worth here, and this is only the first one. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the background. There's a lot of lore to immerse yourself in, and there's lots of pointers in this book to events that will only get realised in later books. So I think if you're an existing Lords of Midnight player, you're going to have a great time picking up on all the sort of slightly in references that you may encounter during the way and enjoy it as a story. If you're a straight fantasy fan, you're going to love it. And if you are coming from a position that you've read some of my other books, either the ones I did for Elite or my own Shadewood Saga, you're going to get the same kind of classic Drew Wagar experience, which is focused on characterization and excitement and page-turning adventure. If you've read any of my books, you know that I like to end chapters on cliffhangers. I like to have really interesting characters that you can either relate to or love or hate or kind of get involved in and feel sorry for, or miss, depending on what's going on. So that is what I've created. I hope you enjoy it. The launch is coming up very, very soon. I'm very, very excited to see what everybody makes of it, and I hope that you are too. So Lords of Midnight is coming, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.